when we look at the spear in the hand in the butterfly caterpillar image, the hand has been stylized so that you have a very narrow wrist and a graduated broadening up the forearm, because then it becomes a direct echo of the harpoon. In other hands, in other images that are focused on hands, there's a broader wrist, and it almost as though you used a stencil or the same form for some of the ideas. And I'm thinking of the 436 and 26 in particular that seem to be formed in a roughly similar way. It's a book full of hands. It's an action book. People are always touching and changing things through touch or through the extended touch of the harpoon. And so in many cases, the hands are and the arms are formed in a roughly similar way, and then you have this huge change in 250 when it's suddenly the hand of God or heaven itself reaching down, right? And so then it's powerful, massive hand. But the hands in 430, is it 436, 437? I thought it was 436. And 436 and 26 in the arms, yes, 436 responds to the image that is on the top of the page for 437, I guess. So please forgive me. I'm sketching around in my, I have a Kindle version and a print version, and I thought it would be easier to navigate today in Kindle on my Mac. So please forgive me. I'm running. Of course, this is the way that all interviewers do it, right? Is you have your Kindle and your Skype open and like the script. Certainly. But if we can talk about the marks on my arm first, the tattoos and that image of for 436, it's such a plain image. But again, you have the arms almost as opposing forces. And they're open at the other end, sort of almost open to the page, where the skin, what would it be, skin or the flesh, but it seems open to other marks or the unseen marks that he doesn't discuss in a way. Do you mind talking about that one first?
No, not at all. And in this case, actually, it may be a bit more mundane, although I do, again, I sometimes... Other people often help me understand my work perhaps better than I'm able to understand it myself with their observations. So I think there is often something to my process that remains a mystery to me. And I tend to create art very intuitively. Since, and this is going to seem like a digression, but it's actually not. It's actually directly connected to that idea. Since I do not have any kind of artistic education or training or anything along those lines, other than simply being self-taught and simply following my own ideas and my own visions for the majority of my life, the last art class that I took was in 1987 as a freshman in community college. It was just a basic drawing class. And so for 22 years leading up to this project, everything that I did was entirely self-guided and self-taught. And so because of that, the art, the idea of making images and making marks on pages, it occupied a very specific role in my life. And it was one that was always guided more by intuition and a kind of dream logic than a really specifically thought through, articulated, and well-known kind of thinking. It really was something that I felt like I had this strange superstitious belief that I actually still have, really, and this continues to dominate my working methods, that to examine it too closely, that to try to understand my processes too thoroughly would be to destroy them. That if I would come to know exactly why it is I did everything I did and why what was coming through in these illustrations and these images that I was making, not just for Moby-Dick but for everything, that if I knew exactly how it was happening and tried to do so in order to master it, that the gift would leave me. which I know sounds perhaps rather strange and superstitious, but because of that, I actually tend to avoid thinking things through in that sort of critically investigative way and choose to work completely intuitively, and see that really suits me well because I am not an artist. I don't have to depend on, well, I'm not an artist in the sense that I do not make a living from it, and it does not have, I think, well, up until this point in my life, it did not have a whole lot to do with how others perceived me or what value they placed on me as a human being, because, of course, here in the United States, of course, your entire value is so often extrapolated from how much you earn and what your career is.
Right.
And so, because of that, I could sort of be jealously possessive of the fact that art for me retains that same sense of mystery and wonder that it does to the innocent child simply drawing whatever. There's a very direct connection between my mind and the page. There's not any real filter. And so that does keep sometimes a lot of the process a bit of a mystery to me, which I prefer. But, I still can look at these. I still can look at all of the images I've made, and not only can I remember nearly everything about the creation of that image down to, what I was doing that particular day, who ended up with that piece of art, why they liked it, what conversations we had about it. So this one in particular, it's interesting again that I like that you notice the presence of hands throughout this, and we'll talk about that large one, that essentially that hand of God in a moment, because that's connected to a very powerful childhood memory of mine. But yes, so many of these hands followed this same sort of template. It wasn't an actual template that I traced, but it was just this idea of these really these just very simple, almost cartoonish hands. I don't have a lot of interest, as you can tell by looking at this project, I don't have a lot of interest in reality. And so much of my childhood was dominated by cartoons and comic books and fantasy imagery and things like that. So this, this representation of these overly simplified, almost cartoony hands is just directly tied to that. I didn't really ever want to draw hands that looked real because to me that wasn't the way I saw the story. But I like that you notice that there are so many of them in there because these hands are all mine. They're all my hands because sometimes the only way I could make sense of this book was by making these pictures, making these images. And making these images is something that I did with my hands. It was an extremely tactile thing, using the found paper, the texture, the smell of the found paper, the feeling of being in that studio and having those papers and, the inks and the paint under my fingernails and the brushes and the pens in my hand. It was an extremely hands-on tactile process that came, in a sense, to me, to my mind, to feel like, in a sense, like a trade. The same way one would make shoes or make barrels or make arrows or something like that. I felt less like an illustrator or an artist and much more like, a journeyman or an apprentice learning a trade. So these images, this was my apprenticeship. This was my working with my hands, learning to control my hands and learning to really grab a hold of this story, not in a forceful way or a violent way, but learning to take this story, which is just ideas, which is words on a page or ink on paper, and try to grab it and massage it into some kind of shape. Because since, as I told you before, I'm much more comfortable communicating with images than with words, by taking this story with my hands and making it into a series of images which convey the story to me better and more powerfully and more emotionally and more viscerally, that was what my responsibility was. That was almost what my holy calling was. So these hands, they're really all mine, regardless of the role they played, regardless of whose, other than the hand of God, regardless of whose hands they were, whether they were Queequegs or common sailors or one of the harpooneers, in a sense, all of these hands were mine because I inhabited all of those roles as a reader and as an illustrator, and all of the sailors, all of the harpooneers, they all became me and I became them, which was why at the end, coming to the end of this project was actually very emotionally traumatic. I thought that after having been obsessed with this so long and at times even resentful of it near the end, that I would be overjoyed and elated to reach the end because I would feel as if I had my life back and I was able to leave this closet that I had been imprisoned in working on this project for so long. But it was actually devastating for me because the end is so bleak and it's so nihilistic, it's so apocalyptic. Not only does the story end, you cannot go beyond the last page of the story. You just can't. The story ends
Right.
with a terrifying and devastating finality to any book. But the conclusion of Moby-Dick is incredibly bleak and incredibly nihilistic, and I knew that in using my hands to create these images, I felt very much that I had become, I was the architect of that destruction. I was completely complicit in the death of all of these characters that I had inhabited and that I had become and that had, in a sense, become my friends. So there was this overwhelming sense of guilt that at times even lingers to this day when I think about the conclusion of it, that, I was the one that sent them all to this horrible, watery doom of theirs. And, it didn't help that near the end I was identifying with Ahab to a degree anyway because of the way
Right.
I had become so obsessed with this particular task.
Right.
So anyway, I'm digressing, and I apologize. I tend to do that. But these
Oh,
hands,
no.
they're all mine. And this image in particular became the way it was because the role of the found paper, the role of the material was essential to the image itself. And so this, I believe, is just a simple conversation between common sailors. There's no overwhelming significance to it. In a sense, this is sort of this nugget of interesting knowledge, but what fascinated me and what has always fascinated me about Moby-Dick is the lives that these whalers led. I simply could never imagine a life of such hardship and deprivation that required such overwhelming courage and bravery.
Right.
So, these men were all remarkable to me, even the lowest of the low, even the cabin boys, even the common deck scrubbers, they were remarkable men to me. And the knowledge that they possessed, which to them almost seemed commonplace, is, of an almost mystic kind of significance for us. So, you have this passage there talking about the dimensions of the whale skeleton and so on, and I chose this particular piece of paper because I had taken this stack of printer paper, 8.5 by 11 paper that you would run through your printer, and I had torn it all in half, and I had a stack of that I would just sometimes use as a blotter if I needed to test, the color of ink or something like that. And so I thought of how this little stack of unassuming and apparently dull printer paper was, really an essential tool in my toolbox. I absolutely needed that little stack of paper to complete this task, to do this task properly and to do this task well. And so the inspiration to use this particular piece, just this tiny, unassuming, I guess it would be a 8.5 by 5.5 piece of paper, was very much an outgrowth of the perception of those kind of sailors, that, even the smallest piece plays an essential part in the greater drama. And so I wanted to elevate that. I wanted to, in putting all those lines of force, that idea of all of this force, this drama, this action, this intensity around these hands, and yet the hands themselves, they're almost serene in this beautiful simplicity, that in spite of all of the agitation around them, they remain calm, they remain steady, they do the task, because, these are the hands of the brave sailors and the brave harpooneers and the brave mates on board these ships. All of these things, again, that's probably the best way I can think of to articulate it, because so much of this would happen for me on a subconscious level, and once the image was fixed in my mind, I would execute it as quickly as possible, so it became as honest and visceral as I could make the response.